Emily drove through the quiet streets of Maple Hill, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The town looked the same maple trees leaning over the sidewalks, the same small bakery on the corner, the same calm that always made her feel both safe and lonely. Her mother had been gone for nearly a year, and though Emily had promised herself she wouldn't return, the call from her father changed everything. His voice had sounded older, thinner, almost broken, so she packed her bags, left her city apartment in New York, and drove back to the house where she grew up. When she pulled into the driveway, the front porch light was already on, as if someone had been waiting for her all day. Her father, Thomas, stood at the door wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn every winter, but his face had changed. The strong lines that once made him look unshakable were softer now. His eyes tired but kind. For a second, Emily froze, because for that single breath, he looked almost like a stranger. He smiled when he saw her. That same quiet smile she remembered from childhood. "You came," he said, his voice rough from emotion. Emily nodded. "I said I would." And for a moment, the air between them was filled with things they both wanted to say, but didn't know how. Inside, the house smelled like her mother's perfume, lavender and soap. Her father hadn't moved anything, not even her mother's shoes by the door or her scarf draped over the chair. It felt like walking into a memory that refused to fade. Emily's throat tightened as she looked around. Everything the same, yet nothing truly alive. They sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where her mother used to hum while cooking. The silence was strange, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Her father tried to ask about New York, her work, her apartment, the people she met, but his words stumbled like someone learning to talk again. Emily answered softly, trying to fill the gaps with stories about the city. She wanted to make him smile, but each laugh felt borrowed, like something from another life. That night, as Emily unpacked her suitcase in her old bedroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror and froze. For a moment, she saw not herself, but her mother. The same eyes, the same shape of mouth, the same quiet sadness. She understood then why her father's eyes had lingered earlier, not in any wrong way, but in a painful one. He saw his wife everywhere, and now that Emily had returned, he couldn't help but see her ghost in his daughter's face. Later, she went downstairs for water and found him in the living room, sitting in the dark with the television off. His hand was resting on her mother's photograph, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. He looked up when she entered, startled, then smiled faintly. "You still walk like her," he said without thinking. Emily didn't know what to say, so she just stood there, her heart aching. The house was too full of memories, too full of everything they had lost. Over the next few days, Emily tried to bring light back into the home. She cleaned, opened the curtains, cooked breakfast. The first morning she made pancakes. Her father stood in the doorway watching her, the scent filling the kitchen. "You're just like her," he murmured again, almost to himself, and Emily forced a smile, knowing he didn't mean it to hurt, but it did. They spent the days walking through the garden her mother once loved. Thomas told stories of how he met her mother in college, how shy she was, how she used to write him letters even when they lived in the same town. Emily listened quietly, watching how his face softened with every memory, and when he laughed, she could see how deeply he had loved her mother, so deeply that even now he didn't know how to let her go. One evening, while organizing the attic, Emily found a box of old home videos. She brought it downstairs and they watched them together, the screen flickering with pieces of the past. There was her mother in a yellow dress, laughing, holding little Emily in her arms. Her father sitting beside them, young and proud. The sound of her mother's voice filled the room. And for a moment, it was as if she had never left. When the video ended, Emily noticed tears in her father's eyes. He didn't try to hide them. He looked at her and whispered, "You sound like her too." Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to comfort him, to say something that could take away that loneliness. But she couldn't find the words. They both sat in silence, the screen fading to black. At night, Emily could hear her father walking around, sometimes talking softly to himself, sometimes humming her mother's favorite tune. It was haunting and tender at the same time. She began to realize that he wasn't just grieving his wife. He was lost without her. And Emily's presence had brought those feelings back stronger than ever. Still she stayed. She made tea for him in the mornings, read aloud from her mother's favorite books in the evenings. It became their quiet ritual, like trying to heal a wound that would never completely close. Sometimes, when Emily read, Thomas would close his eyes and listen, and she could see how his breathing slowed, how his shoulders relaxed. One Sunday afternoon, they drove to the lake. It was the same place where her parents used to take her as a child. The water shimmered under the sunlight. The air smelled of pine and rain. Emily sat on the dock while Thomas skipped stones across the surface. "Your mother loved this place," he said. "She used to say the lake made her feel alive." Emily nodded. "I remember," she whispered, looking at the ripples spreading across the water. They sat there for a long time, neither speaking, letting the wind carry their thoughts. When they returned home, something felt different, lighter somehow. That night, her father made dinner for the first time since her mother's passing. It wasn't perfect, but Emily smiled and ate every bite. He laughed when she teased him about burning the garlic, and for a brief second it felt like the old days. The three of them together. Later, as they cleaned the kitchen, Thomas looked at Emily and said quietly, "It's good having you here." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "It's good to be home," she replied. But deep inside, she felt a strange pull, not love, not confusion, but something heavier. It was the weight of being the only one left who reminded him of everything he had lost. Every glance, every small smile from him carried the ache of memory. He didn't see her, not really. He saw the woman he once loved reflected in her face. That night, Emily sat by her window, watching the soft glow of the streetlights. The town was quiet, peaceful, yet her heart felt restless. She could feel the distance between who she was and who her father saw when he looked at her. And though she didn't blame him, it made her want to cry. The next morning, when she came downstairs, her father was making coffee. He looked up and smiled. "You're up early," he said. She nodded. "Couldn't sleep." He poured her a cup and added, almost shyly, "You know, you have her hands." Emily looked down at her fingers. The same shape. The same small scar on her thumb from childhood. "I guess I do," she said quietly. They drank their coffee in silence. The morning sun spilling across the table. The house was still, except for the sound of birds outside. It was peaceful, yet underneath it all, there was an ache neither could name. That evening, Emily sat by the piano, the one her mother used to play. Her fingers hesitated, then pressed down on the keys. The tune came out soft and slow. Her father stood in the doorway, listening, his eyes glassy. He didn't speak, but she could feel his heart breaking and healing at the same time. When the song ended, he whispered, "That was her favorite." Emily turned, tears welling up. "I know," she said. The house grew quiet again, filled only with the echo of notes fading into the air. And though nothing had been said, everything between them had changed, not into something forbidden, not into love, but into a fragile understanding. Two people lost in the same grief, learning how to breathe again. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she realized something. Her father wasn't holding on to her. He was holding on to the memory of the woman they both loved. And she, though hurt, finally understood. Because love doesn't always fade neatly. Sometimes it lingers in familiar faces, in voices, in the quiet spaces between two hearts still learning to let go. And there, in the house on Maple Street, a father and daughter try to find their way back to life. Step by step, memory by memory, one quiet heartbeat at a time. The rain came early that spring, falling in long, steady lines against the windows of the Maple Street house. Emily stood by the window, watching the drops race down the glass. Her reflection blurred in the mist. Her father, Thomas, was in the kitchen, making coffee like he did every morning, but lately, there was something in the air that neither of them could ignore. It wasn't anger or grief anymore. It was something quieter, more complicated, something that filled the spaces between their words. It had been months since Emily returned home. The house no longer felt haunted, but it still carried her mother's scent, her laughter, her warmth. Emily had filled it again with noise and life. She cooked. She cleaned. She played the piano. Yet sometimes, when she spoke, her father would look at her in a strange way, as if hearing a voice from the past. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't easy either. They began to talk more, sitting together in the evenings, sometimes with tea, sometimes in silence. Thomas asked about her city job, her friends, her dreams, and Emily found herself opening up in ways she never had before. Maybe because she missed her mother. Maybe because her father was the only one who understood that kind of emptiness. And the more they talked, the more she noticed small things. The way he listened so intently. The way his voice softened when he said her name. One night, the power went out during a storm. The house was dark except for the light from the fireplace. Emily sat on the floor with a blanket around her shoulders, and Thomas sat across from her, the orange glow flickering between them. They started reminiscing about her mother again, laughing softly at old memories. She would have scolded me for letting the power go out, Thomas said. Smiling, she hated the dark, Emily smiled too. She used to make shadow puppets for me when I was scared, she said, raising her hand and forming a bird shape in the firelight. Thomas chuckled quietly. I remember that. For a moment, their laughter filled the room, and it felt warm, almost like old times. But then there was silence, the kind that made every heartbeat sound louder. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, he forgot who was in front of him. He saw the same gentle eyes, the same softness around her smile. He blinked, and guilt flickered through his chest. You remind me too much of her, he whispered. His voice low, Emily's smile faded. Do you hate that? She asked quietly. He shook his head, his expression torn. No. I think that's what scares me. Neither of them spoke after that. The fire crackled softly, and the sound of rain filled the silence. There was no wrong intention, no line crossed, just two hearts that had been broken by the same loss, sitting too close to a memory that refused to fade. Days passed and things went back to normal, or at least, they tried to. Emily helped him with errands, joined him on walks. They visited the town library, the farmer's market, the small cafe her parents used to go to. Every place they went carried pieces of her mother. Sometimes Thomas would stop mid-sentence, as if remembering something that made him both happy and sad. One afternoon, they were sitting in the garden when the wind picked up. Emily reached to gather the fallen rose petals, and Thomas stopped her hand. Leave them, he said gently. Your mother used to say the garden needs to grieve too. Emily smiled faintly. You really loved her, didn't you? He nodded, eyes distant. More than my own life. His voice cracked slightly, and Emily's heart ached for him. She wanted to take away that pain, to remind him that he wasn't alone. But when she touched his arm lightly, he looked at her in a way that made her breath catch, not because it was wrong, but because it was full of confusion and longing and love all tangled together. She quickly pulled her hand back and looked away. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, the moonlight spilling across the floor. She felt something inside her, not love, not attraction, but a deep sadness mixed with tenderness. She missed her mother so much that she began to see her through her father's eyes. And she realized that maybe he saw her the same way, like a reflection of everything he lost. Over the next week, she noticed how quiet he'd become. He avoided long conversations, spent more time outside. Tending the garden or sitting by the piano her mother used to play, Emily tried to talk to him. But his answers were short, polite, distant. It was as if he was fighting with himself, with feelings he didn't understand and didn't want to have. One evening, she found him standing in her mother's room, the light from the window falling across his face. He was holding one of her scarves, the fabric worn and faded. Emily stood in the doorway and whispered, "You miss her every day, don't you?" He didn't turn around. "Every second," he said. "But when I look at you, it feels like she's here again. And that breaks me." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Then stop looking for her in me," she said softly. "I can't be her, Dad." He turned then, his expression raw. "I know," he said, his voice shaking. "But you carry her with you. Emily, every time you laugh, every time you speak, it's her. And I can't tell where she ends and you begin." The words hung in the air. Heavy and painful, Emily stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Then maybe it's time to let her go," she whispered. He nodded slowly, but his eyes said he didn't know how. That night they didn't speak again. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the rain outside. Emily sat on her bed, clutching her pillow. Her heart hurt for him, for herself, for the love that had nowhere to go. The next morning, Thomas was already in the kitchen when she came down. He made her coffee and smiled, a small, fragile smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry about last night," he said. "I shouldn't have said that." Emily shook her head. "You didn't mean it in a bad way," she replied. "You're just lonely." He looked down at his hands. "Maybe I am," he said quietly. "Maybe I've been lonely for so long, I don't even remember what it feels like not to be." That day, they spent time apart. Emily took a walk through the woods behind the house, trying to clear her thoughts. The trees whispered in the wind, and she realized how deeply grief could twist love. How easy it was to confuse memory for presence, comfort for affection. She loved her father, but she also knew they were standing on fragile ground when she returned home. He was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. The light touched his face softly, turning the silver in his hair to gold. "I used to watch sunsets with your mother," he said. She said they reminded her that endings can still be beautiful. Emily sat beside him. "She was right," she whispered. For a while, they just sat there, the air warm and still. Then Thomas turned to her and said, "You've grown into such a strong woman, Emily." "I don't tell you that enough," she smiled faintly. "You don't have to, I know." But inside, she felt something shift, a kind of goodbye she couldn't say out loud. Later that night, as she played the piano softly, Thomas stood behind her, listening. The music filled the room with calm. When she finished, he said quietly, "I think it's time I visit your mother's grave tomorrow." Maybe it's time to tell her goodbye. Emily turned, her eyes warm. She'd like that. He nodded. And for the first time, she saw peace flicker in his expression. When he went upstairs, Emily stayed by the piano, her fingers resting on the keys. She thought about how love could change shape, how it could linger even after everything was gone, and how letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live again. That night, she dreamed of her mother, standing by the lake, smiling. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling lighter. She knew that part of healing meant stepping away. Not out of rejection, but out of love. Her father came down with a suitcase in his hand. "I'm going to visit her grave," he said. "And after that, I might take a trip for a while. Maybe to the coast." Emily nodded. "That sounds good." He looked at her one last time, his eyes soft. "You've done more for me than you know," he said. "You brought her back to life for a while, and because of that, I can finally let her rest." She smiled through tears. "Then let her rest, Dad, and let yourself live." He left soon after, and Emily stood by the window watching him drive away. The rain had stopped, and sunlight poured through the clouds. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted. The house was quiet, but it was no longer filled with ghosts. She turned toward the piano and whispered, "Goodbye, Mom," and in that moment, both she and her father began to heal, not through holding on, but by finally learning how to let go, each carrying the memory of love without being trapped by it, both ready to step into a new kind of peace. Summer arrived early that year, warm and golden, filling the streets of Maple Hill with the sound of wind through the trees. Emily sat on the front steps, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the sunlight stretch across the yard. It had been weeks since her father, Thomas, returned from his trip to the coast. He looked healthier, calmer, and there was something gentler in his eyes now, a peace that hadn't been there since her mother's passing. But even with his return, Emily felt a quiet restlessness growing inside her, something that told her her time at home was coming to an end. Life in the old house had found a new rhythm. Thomas spent most mornings in the garden, trimming the rose bushes that his wife had planted years ago. Emily worked remotely, often sitting by the kitchen window, the sound of her father's humming floating in through the screen door. It was peaceful, but it was also bittersweet. The grief that once consumed them had softened, but what replaced it was silence, not painful, just empty. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, Emily found a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of photo albums. Inside was a letter in her mother's handwriting, addressed to Thomas. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll keep living, Thomas. Promise me you'll smile again. Even if it takes years." Emily held the letter in her hands for a long moment, her eyes wet with tears. She knew her father had probably read it 100 times. But somehow, she felt the letter was meant for both of them now. She brought it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. When Thomas came in from the garden, wiping his hands on a towel, she said softly, "I found something you should see." He froze when he saw the letter, his expression unreadable. Then he sat down, tracing the familiar handwriting with his fingertips. "Your mother always knew what to say," he murmured. "Even when she wasn't here anymore." Emily watched him carefully. "She wanted you to live, Dad, not just survive," she said. "You don't have to keep this house like a museum." She wouldn't have wanted that. Thomas looked around, his gaze landing on the framed photos, the still piano, the untouched scarf on the chair. "I guess I didn't know how to do anything else," he admitted. "Everything here felt like her, and I was scared to lose even that." Emily smiled gently. "You're not losing her, Dad. You're just making space for yourself again." The next morning, Thomas began to change things, slowly at first, moving old furniture, donating some of her mother's clothes, opening windows that had been shut for years. It was painful, but it was freeing too. The house began to feel different, lighter. The air no longer carried the heavy scent of memory, but the freshness of something new. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together, laughed more easily, talked about the future, not the past. Thomas even mentioned visiting friends in Oregon, something he hadn't done since before his wife died. Emily encouraged him. "You should go," she said. "You deserve to live again." He looked at her with pride. "And you, Emily, you've been taking care of me for too long. You have your own life to live." The words hit her harder than she expected, because deep down, she knew he was right. Her time in Maple Hill had been about healing, about helping her father find his way out of the fog of grief. But now that he was standing again, she had to learn to move forward too. That night, Emily sat by the piano, her fingers tracing the keys. The room was quiet, the air warm with the hum of cicadas outside. She began to play softly, not her mother's favorite song, but her own. Something she'd written in the city and never shared. Thomas came downstairs, listening from the doorway. When she finished, he clapped quietly, smiling. "That was beautiful," he said. "It sounded like hope." Emily laughed softly. "Maybe that's what it is." A few days later, Thomas announced that he would be leaving for Oregon at the end of the week. Emily helped him pack, folding shirts, labeling boxes. She found herself smiling more than crying, because this time, the leaving didn't feel like loss. It felt like life beginning again. On his last night before the trip, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars. The air was cool, the garden full of the scent of roses. "Do you remember the first time you brought me out here?" Emily asked. "I was 5, and Mom told us not to stay up so late." Thomas chuckled. "And we both fell asleep on that bench until she came out with a blanket." They both laughed quietly. Then Thomas turned serious. "You know, Emily, I used to be afraid that I'd never move past her death. But now, I think she's the reason I can. She's still here, just different." Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "She'd be proud of you," she said. "She'd be proud of both of us." The next morning, Emily stood in the driveway as he loaded his bags into the car. The sun was rising, soft gold on the horizon. He turned to her and said, "You'll be okay here." She nodded. "Yes, Dad, I will." He smiled, then hugged her tightly. "You've always been my strength," he whispered. "I hope you know that." As his car disappeared down the road, Emily stood there for a long time, the wind brushing her hair. The house behind her felt different now, not empty, not haunted, just quiet. Over the next few weeks, Emily settled into a new routine. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She opened her laptop and began applying for new jobs, considering moving to a new city. She even went to a small cafe downtown where she met new people. One of them, a kind man named Daniel, worked as a photographer, and they started talking over coffee every Sunday. Emily didn't think much of it at first, but his warmth reminded her that life still had new beginnings waiting. Slowly, she began to smile in ways that weren't tied to the past. One afternoon, she received a postcard from her father. It had a picture of a lighthouse and a short message. "The ocean is peaceful. I think she'd like it here. I finally feel free, love." "Dad," Emily held the postcard against her heart. Tears in her eyes, she whispered to herself, "You did it." "Dad." She walked to the garden, the roses blooming brighter than ever. The sunlight danced through the leaves, and for the first time in a long while, she felt no weight in her chest. The memories were still there, that they didn't hurt anymore. They were gentle now. That evening, Emily played the piano again, this time with the windows open wide, letting the sound drift into the summer air as she played. She thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the confusion, the healing. She realized that love had never left the house. It had just changed shape. It wasn't about clinging to what was gone. It was about carrying it forward with grace. When she finished playing, she stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. A soft smile curved her lips. She whispered, "Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Dad," even though she knew neither of them was truly gone. They were both with her, in the light, in the air. In her heart, that night, Emily dreamed again of her mother by the lake. This time, her mother didn't wave or speak. She just smiled, peaceful and proud. When Emily woke up, the room was filled with the morning sun, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years: contentment. A few months later, Emily sold the old house. Not out of sadness, but because it was time. She packed her mother's photographs, the piano, and a few keepsakes, leaving behind the echoes of grief that had once filled those walls. As she locked the door for the last time, she whispered a quiet thank you. She moved to a small coastal town where the air smelled of salt and new beginnings. Daniel helped her settle in, and though they didn't rush into anything, there was a gentle bond growing between them. She found work at a local art studio, teaching children to paint. Every time she saw them smile, she thought of her parents, of how love could return in new forms if you let it. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, Emily sat by the shore, sketchbook in hand. She drew the outlines of a house, a garden full of roses, and two figures standing on a porch beneath the stars. She wrote beneath it, "Love never leaves. It just learns to live differently." As the waves touched her feet, Emily closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sunset against her skin. She was no longer haunted by loss or shadowed by the past. She was simply living, finally free, finally whole. And somewhere far away, in a quiet garden in Oregon, her father stood among the roses, whispering her mother's name with a smile. Not in pain, but in gratitude, because in letting go, he had found peace, and so had she. The wind carried the scent of roses through the air, across states, across time. A silent reminder that love, the kind that survives loss and distance, never truly ends. It just changes, softens, and becomes something new. Something eternal. Something pure. And that was how Emily learned that even after goodbye, the heart can still bloom again, just like the roses on Maple Street.